Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20056 in the name of Alexander Stewart on controlling the rising benefits bill in Scotland. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And I call on Alexander Stewart to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion in my name. Once again, it falls to the Scottish Conservatives to highlight the ever-increasing benefit bill facing Scottish taxpayers. My motion highlights the unsustainable social security spending commitments this SNP government have made since receiving significant powers over benefits in 2016. Let me make it quite clear, Presiding Officer. When we say the SNP rising benefit bill is unsustainable, we mean that. The SNP spend more on benefits than they do on our schools and our police. £1 in 7 of this government spend goes on the benefit budget. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has forecast that the Scottish benefit bill will rise by £9 billion by 2029-30. The SNP have already spent £1.2 billion each year since the top-up and the lack for the grants the adjustments. So by 2029-30, the figure is forecast to a shocking £2 billion. Audit Scotland has said that the Scottish Government, and it quotes, has not yet set out a detailed strategy of how it will manage the forecast gap between social security funding and the spending within its overall budget. That is a damning indictment, Presiding Officer, coming from Audit Scotland. However, it's not surprising because as far as the SNP and it shows intention, benefits under their control is not something they see as a priority. Yes.
Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful to the member for taking the intervention. I wonder if he would like to outline which benefits is he going to take away which have devolved to Scotland, which of them are you going to take away and how is he going to do it?
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the member for his intervention. We need to have a real discussion about universality and the way that we look at benefits. Now, we've already said that this SNP's light touch when it comes to keeping records and benefits are vitally important. So we want to see the economy grow. We want to get people off the benefit, Mr Balfour, into the job market so they can have prosperity and move forward. As I said, taking adult disability payment, for example, this is the largest of all the devolved benefits and is the biggest contributor to the SNP's overspend in this area. By 2029-30, ADP alone will be costing the Scottish Government taxpayer £770 million, more than the equivalent. Yes, happy to take one.
Cabinet Secretary.
Grateful to the member. I wonder if the member could tell the Chamber whether the Scottish Conservatives voted for or against all the secondary legislation that built in all the eligibility for ADP that he's about to criticise.
Alexander Stewart.
Yeah, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. Yes, I think you'll find that we did vote for it, but you have to understand that your light touch approach, and I'll come on to the light touch approach that you have when it comes to ensuring that individuals are, and the number of individuals who we have found to be in error or in fraud in this process will be something we can further discuss, Cabinet Secretary. As I say, £770 million is expected to be where we are. And the ADP's light touch review system may be one of the biggest drivers in increasing the cost compared to the personal incapacity benefit, the PIP system that we have. This current review system allows claimants to self-declare that their circumstances have not changed. That just means a tick in a box, Presiding Officer. It's hardly surprising that the Auditor-General concludes that Social Security Scotland does not have a reliable figure for the amount lost to fraud or error. You wouldn't repay it either. A recent FOI request from Social Security Scotland reported that just 29 cases of fraud were found in 23-24. This is compared to the thousands of cases that are likely to have happened. If the SNP are at all serious about addressing spiralling benefit costs, they must look at this naive approach when it comes to fraud and error. Presiding Officer, our motion speaks about the UK Government's decision to remove the two-child limit. The decision will cost taxpayers at least £2 billion extra in the coming years, and the strain will be on our public services. It is not the right priority for either the UK Government or the Scottish Government in the current climate, and we cannot support that decision. The SNP have already set aside £155 million to remove the cap in Scotland. This is money which could have been spent elsewhere. Under the SNP, how long has it been since we've seen that across the UK? So I hope that that £155 million could be used to support hardworking families and hardworking taxpayers. But we have already heard from the First Minister himself that he confirms that the extra money will be added straight back into the benefit bill. I'm running out of time, thank you. If this decision doesn't sum up the Scottish Government's high tax, high welfare approach to government, I don't know what does, Presiding Officer. Having spent years campaigning about and complaining about the previous UK Government's approach to benefits, the SNP are now discovering it isn't as easy as it looks. And their own in-house benefit agency, Scottish Social Security, estimated costs were about £300 million back in 2017. That's now blossomed to £700 million by 2023. The government refuses to learn any lessons, and today, judging from Shirley-Ann Somerville's amendment, they won't be changing any time soon. Their amendment not only ignores the £2 billion spending gap, but it also calls on the UK Government to increase UK benefits even further. Labour at least acknowledge there is a funding gap in the process. However, it also celebrates Labour's decision to remove the two-child limit by increasing taxes on working people. We therefore cannot support that amendment because of that, Presiding Officer. Scotland's benefit system should be an essential safety net for those who need and who need that assistance. We can all agree on that principle across here. The Scottish Conservatives believe this system must be fair and it must be affordable. We must ensure that the spiralling costs, and it should not be put on the backs of hard-working Scottish taxpayers. This is where we differ from all parties in this chamber, because the left-wing consensus wants to ensure that these principles are kept. The scale of the problem is big, and the SNP government cannot ignore it. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, instead of burying their head in the sand, this is a time for this government to be honest with the Scottish taxpayer about how they will fix the mess that they have created. I move the motion in my name. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville to speak to and to move Amendment 20056.3. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. Well, we've just heard from the Scottish Conservatives setting out an apparent repudiation of the benefit system, which this Parliament voted for unanimously, and which, in my case, certainly I'm proud we've established. The 2018 Social Security Scotland Act was unequivocal, enshrining in statute the principle that social security is an essential investment in the people of Scotland, based on dignity, fairness and respect. It's a safety net for all of us because we may all need it at some point in our lives. And like Mr Stewart, I am unwavering in those principles. Principles which I must say are even more important today than they were 7 years ago because of the cost of living crisis, particularly brought on by Brexit. And I'm also unwavering, and so is the First Minister, in this government's commitment to eradicate child poverty, which is why it's so remarkable and, quite frankly, grotesque to hear politicians still talk and champion the two-child limit, despite the 20,000 children in Scotland which it was condemning to unnecessary additional hardship.
Elizabeth.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for giving way. Does she recognise that within public opinion there is actually quite considerable support for the two-child cap because it is seen to be about the incentives that are given to families? Because this debate about social security should be about incentives as to whether you feel that the benefits will be more productive or whether being in work will have that greater incentive.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's very important, and I thank Liz Smith for her question, but I think it's very important to actually recognise that, contrary to some of the incorrect narratives that are currently in play, the Resolution Foundation has set out very clearly that the abolition of the two-child limit helps working families because 3 in 5 families set to benefit from its scrapping include at least one person in work. And that's what genuinely disappoints me about this, is about the othering of poor people, the othering of those that do not have, I'll make some progress if Mr Hoy will forgive me, the othering of people who require social security support. Because who knows, Presiding Officer, what will happen in our lives? A marriage breakup, caring responsibilities that make it very difficult for a family who was coping once well financially to then actually deal with circumstances in the future. And I'm not going to turn my back on those children, even if the Scottish Conservatives are. Presiding Officer, our benefit investment is fully funded, and that's exactly because we balance our budget every year. If Mr Hoy wanted more time, he should have given the whole afternoon to this, and I would have been delighted to discuss this with him in further detail. We balance our budget every year, despite what's been more of a decade of welfare cuts from successive UK governments. Now, we recognise the fiscal challenges facing the public finances. That's why we have a strategy and a plan in place for a sustainable path. Now, let's be very clear, the budget process is underway, but this SNP government will stand resolutely behind the support we deliver for people. Unlike Westminster, we will not be cutting support for disabled people, and we will never accept cruel policies like the two-child limit. Now, in terms of future spending, it's important here to emphasise that the proportion of the resource budget which the Scottish Government has chosen to invest in enhancing social security compared to England and Wales is projected to increase by less than 1% by 29-30 compared to this current financial year. And other than retaining the two-child limit, we've still to hear, and we've not heard again this afternoon, despite raising this point, which one of the benefits the Conservatives would cut. Is it from disabled people? Is it from their carers, who I met this morning? Or is it from those on low incomes, including those that are in work? And Mr Stewart mentioned particular adult disability benefit. The expenditure on ADP is indeed forecast to exceed the value of the block grant because we have chosen to take a fairer approach. Now, I note the comments of the Auditor-General in September where he said, and I quote, "We assess that this has been a successful project." I note from the Resolution Foundation on Monday, the introduction of ADP shows the improving claimant experience is not at odds with keeping caseloads and costs under control. The Resolution Foundation also says by 2025 there is no evidence that ADP is more leniently awarded benefit than PIP, and the latest data does not suggest that ADP is soft touch. Presiding Officer, we have a benefit system that is robust, but it is fair. It is an investment in the people of Scotland, and I'm sorry that the Scottish Conservatives feel they wish to turn their back on the people of Scotland. It perhaps goes to some of the polling evidence that we have seen today. But, Presiding Officer, we will continue to bring forward a social security system that works for the people of Scotland, that delivers for the people of Scotland, and I'm proud to take that to the people next year.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Claire Baker to speak to move amendment 20056.2. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll start by moving the amendment in my name. I want to begin by addressing the framing of today's debate. Titling the motion as being about controlling the rising benefits bill is not just unhelpful, it misunderstands the purpose of social security. Social security is not a discretionary pot to be constrained according to political taste. It is a lifeline, it should be demand-led, it is rights-based and it's essential to supporting people through hardship with dignity. When we talk about social security, we are talking about families who are trying to keep their heads above water, about people who are sick or disabled, about children who deserve the security and opportunity that far too many are denied. And reducing this debate to a question of control risks stripping away the humanity and responsibility that should underpin these decisions. Briefly,
Elizabeth.
For giving way. It is about incentives. That's what this debate ought to be about, because the benefit system at the moment, absolutely fine for those who are most in need, but it's attraction for the other people who could well be in work but who are not seeking work because there is no incentive for them to go to work. That's what this debate should be about, should it not?
Unfortunately, the evidence shows that the two-child cap just led to more people living in poverty. It didn't do anything to incentivise people into employment. I agree the way out of poverty is through employment, but the policies were introduced by the previous government didn't manage to achieve any of that. And our amendment today sets out the challenges clearly. Audit Scotland have raised serious concerns about a £2 billion funding gap in devolved social security spending by 29-30, and they have highlighted the absence of any detailed Scottish Government plan to deal with that. The Scottish Government has chosen to expand entitlements. I'm very short of time, sorry. To expand entitlements, but these choices must be matched with credible financial planning, and warm words do not fund commitments, responsible government does. The announcement in the UK budget of the removal of the two-child limit is a significant anti-poverty measure, and it should be welcomed. It will lift an estimated 450,000 children across the UK out of poverty, including around 95,000 people in Scotland. It is the single most cost-effective action to drive down child poverty rates, and it is unquestionably the right thing to do. So let us be clear, as I've said, the two-child cap was a deliberate Conservative policy choice. It is one that pushed families into poverty and imposed long-term costs on health, education and economic potential. Removing it was the right thing to do, taking it at the right time when it could be delivered sustainably and responsibly. But the nature of child poverty has also changed. Nearly three-quarters of children in poverty in Scotland are in working households. Poverty today is not simply an issue of unemployment, it's about low pay, insecurity and the rising cost of essential goods. That is why actions such as increasing the national living wage, raising the basic rate of universal credit, supporting energy bills and strengthening the employment rights matter. These measures help working families stay afloat. And in Scotland, after 18 years of SNP government, relative child poverty after housing costs has fallen by just 1%. The Government's own targets will not be met unless there is urgent action on the areas where it has fallen short, by investing properly in employability services rather than cutting £30 million from the budgets, and addressing Scotland's housing emergency, which leaves 10,000 children in temporary accommodation. We cannot talk seriously about tackling poverty without addressing the central role of work. For those who can work, secure employment is the most sustainable route out of poverty. Parents need flexible work options, affordable childcare and targeted support to get into and progress within the labour market. Too many young people are not in education, training and employment, and the disability employment gap in Scotland is wider than the rest of the UK, with almost 300,000 working-age people in Scotland out of work because of illness. So I'll conclude by saying Scotland needs a government that sets out a credible plan for funding its commitments, that aligns social security with opportunity and that uses every lever at its disposal to improve people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Baker. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Our social security system embodies the duty we have to one another. It provides a Best Start grant when a new Scot is born and the Scottish Child Payment as that child grows. When that young person enters work for the first time, they may be able to claim the Job Start grant. And even when, hopefully much later in life, they die, the funeral support payment is there to ensure they are laid to rest with dignity. I ask the Conservatives, what do they want to cut? They would clearly prefer to keep the two-child limit and rape clause in place, despite the overwhelming evidence that these have caused significant increases in child poverty. The estimated 20,000 children brought out of poverty by lifting the cap would go straight back there if the Tories had their way. And yes, I'll take the intervention.
I thank Maggie Chapman for giving way. Does she accept that the interplay between universal credit and the Scottish Child Payment is resulting in some people choosing not to work additional hours, that they would be willing to do so had that mechanism not been put in place?
Maggie Chapman.
I think that has more to do with the problems of universal credit than anything else, quite frankly, and the restrictions placed on people who want to work a few additional hours, not full-time. Social security should be seen as an investment in our economy as well as our people. We know that money paid out in social security circulates in local economies, being spent in local businesses. The End Child Poverty Coalition estimates that local economies would benefit by as much as £19 million per constituency by lifting the cap. Alexander Stewart's own region covers Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy, which would regain £2.5 million. Russell Findlay's constituents in Paisley and Renfrewshire North and South would together get £4 million back. Next time they are knocking on doors, they will need to look their poorer constituents in the eye and explain why they don't want that money back in their pockets and in their communities. And if the disaster of PIP wasn't enough, perhaps they want to take it from adult disability payment. The truth is, though, that like so many payments, ADP is helping too few people, not too many. 63% of those who have applied for ADP in the last year have been rejected. That's worse than PIP.
Ms Chapman, please resume your seat for a second. There's a conversation, unbelievably, going on between two members on front benches from sedentary positions, which is extremely discourteous to Ms Chapman and to the Chamber. Please continue, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 63% of those who've applied for ADP in the last year have been rejected. That's worse than PIP. Both the Independent Scottish Fiscal Commission and the Resolution Foundation agree. And we know that many don't get the right decision the first time. In ADP's short history, 60,000 people have asked for a second opinion. Some have had to go all the way to court to get what they are owed. So I would argue, actually, that this shows we need more money in these kinds of social security payments, not less, like the Scottish Conservatives seem to be arguing. I do agree with the Cabinet Secretary about the need to have a social security system that is there for all of us in case we need it. But for disabled people now, they are struggling. When I raised this last week, the Minister for Equalities didn't answer my question specifically about what changes, if any, have been in Social Security Scotland to lead to these changing figures. So I hope the Cabinet Secretary can tell us why so many stats are going in the wrong direction. More rejections, more appeals, fewer people getting the highest rates they deserve. But in closing, Presiding Officer, the Conservatives ran the social security system across the UK for 14 years, and the motion today is evidence, as if any more were needed, that they learned nothing from their mistakes. Not from those who took their own lives out of despair from benefit sanctions and losing disability support. Not from the thousands of % increase in food parcels given out because social security doesn't meet people's basic daily needs. And not learned that if we want a society that is prosperous, fair and equal, then the social security system for all is vital. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call on Willie Rennie to open on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
I want a caring system. I want a system that respects people when they're in need. That's why we supported the 2016 Act. It's why we believe in the fairness, dignity and respect approach. We believed that when you're creating a new welfare state, that we needed to come together to create those new central pillars for it. And there was one classic example of one of my constituents who told me that unlike the previous system run by the DWP, that she was believed. And there was relief on her face that she was believed. And I think she was right that she deserved that respect. And that's why I was pleased that that had filtered through into the system. And it's why I'm also pleased that the two-child cap has gone, because it was effectively punishing the children rather than the adults. And therefore, I don't think that's an appropriate way to deal with a welfare system. However, we can also agree that it's unsustainable the way that the system is, that the £2 billion gap is going to test us quite considerably when we reach that point, that it's also that the levels of economic inactivity at 1 in 4, 1 in 5 that bounces around that is too high, and that not only means there's a significant burden on the social security system, but we're also losing valuable taxpayers to our economy. So on both fronts, it's not sustainable. So of course, I think we can all accept that we have got an enormous challenge. But what I'm more concerned about is what the impact is on individuals. Because the level of economic inactivity in Scotland is far too high. And it's far too high, not unlike in the 80s and 90s, where it was primarily men who had worked in industrial complexes whose bodies were battered and bruised. It is now younger people who've got issues around about mental health and neurodivergence. And we don't have the ability to be able to afford that for the rest of their life. Because unlike in the 80s and 90s, those men, we lost maybe about 20 years worth of economic activity. With these people, if we don't get them into work, they're going to be lost for the rest of their lives, which is bad for them, but it's also bad for our economy. So we need to deal with this. And the most depressing thing about this debate is that it deals in a silo mentality, because we need to have rounded services that help those people. Now, there was an example of a young person in my constituency who was in his 20s. When he was at school, he received support for his ADHD. When he left school, he went off the rails. He's been lost to the economy for 4 years now, because there is no adult neurodivergent service for them in Fife. And that is replicated right across the country. So what is the NHS doing? Do they not understand that it's important that they orientate their services to help the economy? If we don't get these people back to work, we won't have the taxes to raise to pay for the vital NHS services that we rely on now. So we need to have a rounded system. And I know the Deputy... I've only got 30 seconds. So I know the Deputy First Minister has been leading some work on this. But the situation is urgent. We need to get all of our services aligned, focused on that 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people who are economically inactive. Because unless we get the services, not just in terms of skills and housing and all the rest that are referred to in the Labour motion, but also in terms of the NHS, we need to make sure that we are focused on getting them back to work for their own sake, for the taxes' sake, but also for the economy's sake.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Liz Smith to be followed by Emma Roddick. Ms Smith.
Thank you. This debate is important, not just because of the persistent warnings from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, Audit Scotland and all the other economic forecasters that the ballooning welfare bill is seriously threatening the fiscal sustainability of Scotland's future, but also because they believe that the system is neither sufficiently transparent nor is the Scottish Government sufficiently accountable for the decisions that it makes. And that was confirmed by the Auditor-General yesterday at the Finance Committee. And he's rightly complaining that the Scottish Government is not sufficiently transparent in explaining how, and just as importantly, which tax policies contribute to the Scottish budget policy profile. But it's also an important debate because far too many politicians, including Scottish ministers, shy away from these problems, especially just before an election, because they hope that they will go away, which of course they're not going to because they are now so serious. And as Fraser Nelson wrote yesterday in his latest article, we will not solve that problem if we only indulge in a political blame game, because we're all guilty, I think, of ignoring the extent of the problem. And by the way, to Mr Balfour's point, is part of my frustration in this Parliament, people have heard it before, that we continually seem to avoid the necessary debate about which universal payments should be a priority and which are not. And the Cabinet Secretary was on record, if I remember, not that long ago at the Social Security Committee, when she quite rightly set out one of the issues that the government was facing about not being able to roll out free school meals to the extent that they would have liked to. So the Cabinet Secretary has to accept that there are issues there for the Scottish Government. I want to, at the minute, Mr Balfour, can I come back to you in just a minute? And Alexander Stewart has set out all the very stark facts that we have to face, and I'm going to rehearse them again. But I do think there is a point to be made that most commentators believe that a large part of this problem is down to the lighter touch approach to welfare applications, namely fewer tough questions for applicants to answer and fewer rejections of applications. Yeah, I think Mr Balfour might have been on that point as well.
Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful to remember, and as she knows, I absolutely agree with her in regard to the issue around universalism and benefits. But the issue that Mr Stewart raised, and again I think you're trying to develop, is around ADP, that actually ADP helps people into employment. If you take ADP people away from people, there may in fact be a negative and more people will end up in employment. And would you recognise going after ADP may be the wrong benefit?
Liz Smith.
Certainly acknowledge just how important it is, because Mr Balfour is quite right that it does take people into work. I think what we have to look at is the exponential rise and the increase in it. That's a matter of concern, and that's what the Scottish Conservatives have been pursuing for some time. And of course, one of the issues about all of this is that we exacerbate some of the economic inactivity problem, because that's a serious issue in quite a number of sectors within the labour market. If it becomes more financially comfortable to be on benefits and more expensive at the same time for employers because of rising costs, and that includes Labour's national insurance charges, then the outcome is predictable. In other words, it would be much better if the welfare debate was much more about the balance of incentives rather than mudslinging, which I have to say happens all too often. But can I just come back very briefly to sum up? Those of us who argue that we should be constrained on this social benefit aspect, we're often told that we lack compassion and decency and that our stance is immoral. I completely and utterly reject that assertion. Not to do anything is what would be lacking in compassion and decency, and not just because of the long-term effects on the benefit claimants themselves, but because of the long-term effects on Scotland.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I call Emma Roddick to be followed by Megan Gallagher. Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad we have the opportunity to debate this today, not because I agree with the motion. I actually fundamentally disagree with the framing of social security as a cost instead of an investment in the people of Scotland, but because I recognise that there is a concerted effort going on by some to claw back money from those who need it the most in the name of being responsible. But it would not be responsible for a government to leave people in poverty. Those of us who know how damaging that is need to take every opportunity we can to speak up against that and bring the debate back to the basics. We have to decide whether, as a country, we want to support people with the essentials, food, heating, health, and eradicate poverty, or protect and expand the disgusting wealth gap that already exists in the UK. Now, the motion specifically mentions adult disability payment. Let me remind Parliament why ADP is essential. We replaced the cruel and demeaning process of personal independence payment, a system which was based on suspicion and targets, with a process built on dignity, fairness and respect. The Tories today seem to want to bring us back to that suspicion and those dehumanising targets. If the Audit Scotland report confirms high demand for ADP, that is because demand is high, and people now have a fairer, more compassionate system to turn to. We cannot then turn them away or deny them their dignity. At a time where we are doing all we can to reduce child poverty, kids living in poverty in our communities, and people across Scotland are still struggling with the cost of living, prioritising cutting tax would be absurd. Tax exists to support the common good, and I'm happy that my taxes here go towards ending child poverty. Now that the UK Government has finally done the right thing and scrapped the two-child cap, what that money that we'd started to spend on mitigating it here should now go towards is extra effort to support families. Because the last UK Government, under Alexander Stewart's party, didn't just cut social security spending. The Tories embarked on a systemic and sustained tearing apart of the security net that is supposed to exist to prevent anyone, including children, including disabled people, including pensioners, from falling below a minimum standard where they can't afford to eat. Yes, I will.
Ms Smith.
I thank the member for giving way. If she is correct in that, can I ask her where she feels that the revenue would be found in order to finance that, because it's a huge, fat bill?
Emma Roddick.
It is a huge investment in people who are otherwise struggling to be productive, active members of society. Now, when we're talking about children and we're talking about disabled people, there is no world in which it is legitimate to allow them to fall into poverty rather than support them financially to be productive members of society. And this doesn't get fixed with one change. And the Scottish Government has a huge job in rebuilding that safety net that was torn apart. That undertaking is not an easy job, even if you're in charge at a UK level, but it is even harder when you're a devolved government working within the constraints and at the whim of a UK government. And unfortunately, this debate today is a good example. The government had stepped up to do necessary work because the UK government refused to scrap the two-child cap, despite knowing the damage that it was doing. Now, late, they've taken action, and the Scottish Government has to readjust priorities and take a new approach. It is possible to at once be glad that the two-child cap will not apply anywhere in the UK, as it shouldn't be, and to be frustrated at the constant difficulty faced in Scotland by that sustained and comprehensive approach being held back because we don't know what the UK Government is going to do next. Yes, the forecasting funding gap is a huge challenge and it's concerning, but it is not inherently a criticism of the priorities that the Scottish Government has set out. The fact that the UK Government's spending and the resulting block grant to Scotland does not provide enough money to tackle poverty is a problem. The fact that the Scottish Government is trying to tackle types of poverty which are a direct result of past UK policies is a problem. And the fact that people will still struggle after this one change is a problem that means we need further investment, not reprioritisation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Roddick. I now call Megan Gallagher to be followed by Pam Duncan-Clancy. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Although I am quite concerned with the speech that we've just heard that there are some members in this chamber who believe that the rules of economics are completely optional. However, turning to my remarks today, Audit Scotland 2025 report into the adult disability payment should serve as a wake-up call to every member of this Parliament. It sets out in clear and unambiguous terms how unstable devolved social security finances are. The report projects a £2 billion funding gap by 2029-30 across devolved benefits, a gap that the Scottish Government has no credible plan to close. This is not a responsible government, this is not a sustainable government, and it's certainly not fair to the people of Scotland who are constantly called upon to foot the bill. Working families, the very taxpayers this government claims to champion, are already paying the price. Middle-income households, teachers, nurses, police officers, small business owners pay significantly more here than what they would in other parts of the UK. But what do they receive in return? A devolved social security system, overspending by hundreds of millions of pounds a year, with no fiscal strategy whatsoever or contingency plan. The Scottish Conservatives believe that individuals with disabilities and who fall in hard times deserve help through benefits. But that does not absolve any government of fiscal responsibility. People expect their taxes to be managed wisely. Instead, they face the possibility of increased taxation or reductions in essential public services, while a benefit system can run at its current scale. Audit Scotland, they could not have been clearer. The Scottish Government is expanding entitlements faster than it can fund them, and is doing so without the transparency or long-term financial planning. Speaking about holding people's taxes to ransom, the UK Labour Government under Rachel Reeves has announced it will abolish the two-child limit on UK-wide benefits. In the budget, she froze income tax and national insurance thresholds, moves that the independent fiscal watchdog for budget responsibilities says that will push more into higher tax bands. This, of course, is the same Chancellor that promised working people would not pay more in tax, but now has to admit that ordinary families must contribute more. That raises a fundamental question for this Parliament. Are benefits the only way to support families? And I think we have to be honest, it's not. Instead, our focus should be on supporting families, especially when it comes to raising children. One of the biggest challenges that families face today is the affordability of childcare. The Scottish Government have all but forgotten the promise that they made to expand funded childcare from 9 months onwards. And if they were truly serious about supporting families with children, they would, as they promised, expand funded childcare from 9 months onwards, ensure affordable, flexible early years provision, support working parents with childcare, not by adding open-ended benefit committees funded by even higher
Ms Gallagher is in her final minute.
If the aim is to support family life, that is where the effort should go, making real practical support to families at the point where they need it most. Not to ask ridiculous questions about what benefits need to be cut. It's about giving people the tools to succeed. Presiding Officer, working people are paying more. Services are delivering less, and the government responsible for this mess wants yet another parliamentary term. They don't deserve it. We cannot afford a government that spends first and thinks later. It's time to put competence before chaos, honesty before spin, and taxpayers before wish lists. Scotland needs a government that respects the people who fund it, not one that treats them as an afterthought. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I now call Pam Duncan-Glancy, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I refer members to my register of interest. Social security exists to provide a safety net, but safety nets are no use with holes in them. To promise a new way but not manage the forecast spend is not just unfair, it's a dereliction of responsibility. So too is marching people up a hill on promises of a kinder approach, when according to the report by Adele Harris OBE into ADP, disabled people remain frustrated with processes, inconsistent decision-making and a lack of understanding of particular conditions. And my inbox reflects this reality. I've had constituents struggle to get information in accessible formats for visual impairment or in another language. We were told this is because the system requires a manual workaround for the production of letters in different formats. But remember, this is an IT system that was millions of pounds overspent, so to fail on a basic aspect of meeting needs is of concern. I've had advice services in Glasgow tell me that they find the system hard to navigate. According to Citizens Advice Scotland, redeterminations and appeals are the fastest growing areas of advice on ADP. That means repeating information and leaves people exhausted, unheard and without hope. And Presiding Officer, then there's the Audit Scotland assessment of a funding of a gap of £2 billion by 29/30 and the absence of a strategy to fill it. Warm words, or as the government amendment says, a commitment to principles, mean nothing if the government can't put their money where their mouth is. That is a government that uses words but doesn't put the hard graft in to deliver the deeds. The job of government is to do things, not just say things. That's why I welcome the announcement from the UK budget of the removal of the two-child limit for universal credit, which will lift an estimated 450,000 children across the UK out of poverty, the biggest projected fall in child poverty on record, according to the JRF. That's the government not just saying empty words, it's acting. And they didn't, and Scottish Labour wouldn't, stop there. Because tackling the causes of poverty and boosting the means of defeating it, such as employability, housing and education, needs action too. Action this SNP government has failed to take. The long-term solution to breaking the cycle of poverty must include supporting people into good, well-paid jobs. That means properly funded colleges to deliver skills, apprenticeships in key skills areas for anyone who qualifies, and support for people who desperately want to work but who face relentless discrimination or barriers to doing so. Figures from the ONS show that the disability employment gap in Scotland still sits at 31.5%. And while some disabled people are unable to work, we know that with the right support and structures in place, many want to work and many can thrive in the workplace and can contribute significantly to the economy. Glasgow Centre for Inclusive Living's Equality Academy is an incredible example of how this can be done. The organisation in my region runs an internship programme providing NHS placements for disabled graduates. The programme supports disabled people to unlock their potential and has an 88% success rate for getting people into work. We need more of that. Then there are the thousands of disabled people left languishing on social care and NHS waiting lists, unable to access the support they need to fulfil their potential. And there are 1.7 million people in Scotland with arthritis or musculoskeletal conditions, conditions that are amongst the biggest causes of persistent pain, disability and working days lost. They could benefit, for example, from a hip or knee replacement, yet at the end of October, 15% of the over 10,000 waits over 52 weeks for inpatient day case treatment in Glasgow were for orthopaedics. It's clear there is still such a long way to go to ensure people are able to realise their human rights, including to work. A Scottish Labour government would set about removing those barriers. We'd clear the waiting list backlog so that fewer people are locked out of work. We'd revitalise colleges and reform employability. And the UK Labour government has already delivered a direct pay rise for 200,000 of the lowest paid Scottish workers. Presiding Officer, this is the sort of action we need. Action to deliver the rights of people to participate in society, to work and to contribute. That's how people have dignity. That's how we empower people. That's how we meet the skills gap in Scotland. And Presiding Officer, that is how we'll not just reduce poverty, it's how we'll consign it rightly to the dustbin of history. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Duncan-Clancy. And I call Jamie Hepburn. Mr Hepburn.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to take part in this debate, although I have to say it follows a recurrent theme from the Conservatives in terms of their increasing use of depressing, screeching rhetoric that we hear various refrains from them. I think I've just started, Ms Smith. I'll get on with identifying some of the screeching articles. I see Mr Lumsden is up the back. He is keen to constantly go on about monster mega pylons or the woke elite. I'm watching Fox News far too often. Craig Hoy's recent debate, the dog whistle or perhaps foghorn debate that he had on illegal immigration and housing. The collective refrain, we heard it from Mr Stewart today, the left-wing consensus. He's been watching Fox News too much.
Mr Hepburn, could we perhaps get to the meat of the...
Absolutely getting to the point of the matter, Presiding Officer, because the point I'm making is that this is again designed around rhetoric, because we heard it quite clearly from Mr Stewart. There's an attack on social security predicated on this not being about getting people into work. We've heard already that we know that those who are in receipt of benefit, be it reserved or devolved, many of them are already in work. And I think it's dangerous, I think it's cynical to stand up in this place and to suggest otherwise, which is clearly what is being done when we talk about it should be the preference to get people into work. We know people in receipt of benefits are already often in employment. And when he talks about fraud, we might take the suggestion from the Tories a bit more seriously. If it hadn't been the last day, we saw a report emerge that we saw £10.9 billion worth of fraud during the period of COVID under their watch, which dwarfs the figure of £5.3 billion of social security spend by the Scottish Government. I am very proud of the Scottish Government's record in utilising the social security powers that it has in implementing a pension age disability payment and implementing the adult disability payment, which the Resolution Foundation has said is proving to be a more claimant-centred and dignified process. I'm proud of the Scottish Child Payment, which we know is keeping young people out of poverty. The other refrain that we often hear from Mr Finlay, common sense, there's the other rhetoric that we hear from them often, as if it isn't common sense to invest in disabled people into employment, as if it isn't common sense to invest in keeping young people out of poverty. Of course, these things are common. I'm afraid I'm not going to give way to any of the Conservative members. They have given us 4 minutes each to speak to this debate, and I intend to use the entirety of the 4 minutes that I have been given. And of course, they've referred to the Audit Scotland report, but what they failed to mention is that it cited that 87% of ADP applicants felt they were treated with kindness, and of course the cost of administering Social Security Scotland is lower than it was initially forecast. And turning to matters of affordability, it is the case that the Scottish Government has presented a balanced budget each and every year since 2007. I heard the dulcet tones of Mr Kerr earlier, and that was mentioned, saying we are legally obliged to do so. Of course we're legally obliged to do so. Exactly. I don't know what point he thinks he's making. If he thinks he's making a point, it's a stupid point, because the fundamental point is that the Scottish Government has balanced the budget every year, including expenditure on social security. I thought it was telling that we see a party in the Conservatives that say they want to cut social security, but when invited to, Mr Stewart either doesn't have a clue what he wants to cut, or I suspect isn't brave enough to stand up and say what he wants to cut. That's the reality of the Conservatives. I'm proud of the Scottish Government record, and I'll continue to stand behind their investment in the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Hepburn. We now move to closing speeches. I call on Maggie Chapman to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In case it wasn't clear, the Scottish Greens profoundly disagree with the premise of the Conservative motion. The idea that Scotland's benefits bill is somehow a problem to be controlled rather than a lifeline for people to live dignified, independent lives tells us everything about their priorities. Social security is a human right, an investment in our people with real returns, reduced poverty, better health, the ability for people, disabled people, parents, carers, to participate fully in our society and economy. The SAMH briefing we received for today is clear that many disabled people, especially those with mental health problems, for them support like ADP is not a luxury. It enables survival, independence and basic rights. Spending on social security is rising not because Scotland is reckless, but because need is rising. Westminster austerity has deepened hardship, and Scotland has chosen not to abandon people. We spend £1.3 billion more than we receive from the UK Government. That's a political choice, and one which I support. But if we are to be serious about tackling poverty, we must take further steps. The Scottish Government's commitment to redirect money previously set aside to mitigate the two-child cap into other anti-poverty measures is very welcome. The structural investment that will make a tangible difference to families will arise from this. But the SCP remains our flagship tool in the fight against poverty, but we still won't meet our targets in the next 5 years unless that payment rises significantly. With that £150 million now available, we could increase that by £10 a week, lifting 20,000 additional children out of poverty. That's the scale of difference bold action could make. But we have to confront barriers too. The Scottish Fiscal Commission estimates that next year 5% of eligible families, 17,000 children, will miss out because they do not apply. And that doesn't include families who are entitled to but aren't claiming the benefits that they should have. So let's commit to doing far more to help people access what they are due, working with advice services, community organisations and trusted local partners. We must also acknowledge, though, that for some families, SCP, as it currently stands, will never be enough. Spice tells us that around a quarter of families receiving it are so deep in poverty that £27 a week cannot move them out of it at all. While a technical premium for the most deeply impoverished families is not deliverable in the short term, we can act now by using family characteristics that correlate strongly with poverty risk. Young people, especially young single parents, are losing out because UK benefits pay them less, purely because of their age. 55% of children with a parent under 25 are in poverty. One-parent families, Scotland, and 81 partner organisations have called for a Scottish Child Payment top-up for young parents at a cost of only £20 million. That would be an excellent use of the additional funds now available. I'm afraid I don't have time. To close, Presiding Officer, the motion before us assumes that Scottish social security spending is too high. It is not. It is too low. UK payments still sit in the lowest of the OECD. Scotland is lifting them, but from a very low base. Yes, the Scottish Government must plan sustainably, but if we are building new roads during a climate crisis, if wealthy shooting estates can benefit from reliefs intended for small businesses, then we are looking in entirely the wrong places for savings. We should not balance the books on the backs of the poorest people. We must build a system rooted in dignity, equality and compassion, because that is the Scotland people deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Cara Mochan to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And in closing for Labour, I want to thank members from across the chamber for their contributions. It is important that we debate these points because it is clear there are different views across the chamber. Liz Smith commented on this, as did others, and I would say that the debate shows that there are fundamental differences in what people believe in the way in which we support social security. In my view, my colleague Claire Baker made the point very well, and others in the chamber, such as Emma Roddick, made this point, Maggie Chapman. We should all know that social security provision is the cornerstone of a society that cares and is just. And it's about supporting people, and this support includes returning people to economic activity, making sure that there is enough work available for people. All of these things matter, but what the Tories do not acknowledge that as things are, it is a very unequal world out there, and that people are trapped in poverty. Of course,
Liz Smith.
Of course there are inequalities, but is it not the case that way of dealing with these inequalities is to ensure that we have the economic growth that allows us to improve, well, indeed, as my colleague is saying, is to raise people up so that they each have a higher income?
Cara Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do believe that we need to make things fair for people, and the current economic model is not fair. The Labour government, for instance, have increased the living wage, and we get complaints from Conservative members about that. So what we know is that almost 1 in 4 children in Scotland are growing up in poverty, and we need solutions to ensure children have a fair chance to live free from hardship and with opportunities. We need a good social security system to allow children and families to have an opportunity to flourish. And if we can do this for children and for families, then this has a ripple effect which helps society. And this is key because it actually benefits us all. So by us investing in social security, by investing in these children, we are making a difference for everybody in society. So this is why the Scottish Labour are pleased to bring forward our amendment today, welcoming the 2025 UK's budget removal of the 2-child limit for universal credit. And as others have said, about 450,000 children across the UK will be lifted out of poverty, 95,000 we estimate in children. There's always a debate about what we can afford to give to our very poorest in our society. We're told time and time again that that welfare spending is wasteful, but what is really wasteful is having children grow up in poverty. So to me, to be clear, tackling child poverty is an investment in our society. And I've made it clear before, and I will say it once again, I absolutely deplore the previous Tory government's attack on working class people. And I believe the approach taken by the Tory government is to benefit those with the most wealth and power. And it embeds poverty within our society. And that is what we have to tackle. And I believe the Tories on the benches across must accept that their party played a big part in poverty within our constituents today. We know that children living in poverty are in families where at least one adult is working, but they are on very low pay and often on insecure work. What I want to mention just is that Labour believes that the Scottish Government does have to take some steps to make sure that we maximise people's potential. And that, I think, comes back to the point that Willie Rennie made around making sure that we have stable paths for people out of poverty. And by tackling structural barriers, improving pay and hours, increasing progression and supporting the realisation of real workers' rights, these are the things that can change outcomes for people. I don't have a time left, Presiding Officer, but I did want to mention that the Scottish Government do have a responsibility to tell us how they're going to do these things, because we on these benches do believe that will help us with the information that the Audit Scotland report indicated to us about the funding gap. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Morgan. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I begin with a note of consensus, particularly for the speeches from Claire Baker and Carol Mochan, where they both talked about social security being an investment in our society. And Claire Baker was quite right at the start to push back on the Tories' framing of this debate, and indeed the framing around social security in general. And I do very much welcome the scrapping of the two-child limit by the UK Government, long overdue, but we do welcome that. What I would question, though, once we've seen the child poverty strategy coming from the UK Government, is the lack of ambition coming from Scottish Labour and UK Labour, because certainly estimates seem to show that poverty will remain stable once these interventions have been taken by UK Labour, and that's not the level of ambition that we need to see. Certainly.
Claire Baker.
The Cabinet Secretary does recognise that in the speech in Scotland we haven't seen the same kind of pace on reducing child poverty we would want to see. So while we support the child payment, the reduction in child poverty in Scotland is pretty static. It's not moving at the pace we want to see. We do need to see more action in Scotland as well as across the UK.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, we are forecasted to see child poverty falling in Scotland as compared to the rest of the UK. And that's because of the steps that we've taken. But of course we are in the foothills of the budget process, and if Ms Baker and the party want to come forward with suggestions about how together we can work on this key important issue, then I'd be more than welcome to have those discussions with her. She's right to pose that challenge. Presiding Officer, forgive me for the sedentary discussion I had with Craig Hoy earlier on, but I think we got to quite an interesting point where Mr Hoy said that, and feel free to, I'm happy to take an intervention from him if I'm incorrect, thought we should take money away from adult disability payment because we need to cut the benefits bill. So there's an interesting revelation today, not on a speech, but I'm happy to say Mr Hoy agrees with himself.
We want to reduce the benefits bill because if we grow the economy, people will need fewer benefits. But will she answer this question? Why is the removal from adult disability payment in Scotland only 2% of the point of review annually, and it is 16% in the rest of the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because he's comparing apple and pears, Presiding Officer, about the... Well, I'm disappointed if we're going for facts here. Sorry if I'm going to bore you with this, but the fact that this is to do with case transfer and the reviews that happened in case transfer, as opposed to the natural reviews that will happen when disability payments are actually reviewed as part of the normal process. And I would point to the Resolution Foundation for some reassurance in general about how adult disability payment is working. Now, we talk about the ADP, and the Conservatives seem that they do want to cut adult disability payment. I would refer them to their ex-colleague Jeremy Balfour, who quite rightly pointed out that ADP actually helps people into employment. And ADP is not about whether you're in work or out of work. It's there to assist people with the additional cost of having a disability or a condition. That's the premise of ADP. If the Tories don't agree with that premise, they're perfectly entitled to hold a different opinion. Forgive me, I gave way to Liz Smith earlier on, and I gave her a fair degree of time. And she'll forgive me, I won't give way this time. Willie Rennie, as always, gave a very thoughtful contribution. And there's some challenges to the Scottish
Cabinet Secretary,
Government.
please resume your seats. There's a conversation going up the back this time, across benches, from secondary positions, involving 2 members. I wish they could just stop so we could hear the person who's got the floor. Thank you.
His constituent felt believed as part of the devolved social security system, and that's important because dignity, fairness and respect is important. He's right also to point out to economic inactivity being a challenge. We don't have time to get into that discussion today, but I think it's linked to social security, but not entirely, and not necessarily to ADP, but it is something which we are looking at. I would refer Liz Smith very much, and indeed her colleagues, to the Resolution Foundation report that came out on Monday. It looked at caseloads, it looked at awards, and it fairly came to the conclusion that is very different to Liz Smith's, and I would point people to that. Megan Gallagher talked about wanting to spend more on childcare. You know, the funny thing is, we actually do have an opportunity to spend the money that the Scottish Government was due to mitigate against the 2-child limit. We have an opportunity to spend that in a different way. The Tories chose tax cuts rather than childcare, so if Megan Gallagher wanted to do more than just deliver a speech on childcare, then she could have suggested that that money was going to go forward to actually
the Cabinet Secretary is about
people.
to conclude.
Presiding Officer, we've seen 2 different narratives today. We've seen one about division, one about reversal of the progress we've made, one about othering. And we've also seen a different narrative about collective investment, unapologetically tackling child poverty, giving essential assistance to carers, helping old people to heat their homes and helping disabled people with the additional costs of disability. The people of Scotland will have a choice in a few months' time about what kind of future they want. That divisive narrative or a narrative and a principled stance that's there to support people. And I'm proud of our continued investment in the people of Scotland. I'm proud of what we've delivered within devolved social security, and I'm proud to take that record and our vision for the future to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And now Colin Craig Coy to wind up the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please. Thank
you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This has been an important debate and one that we shouldn't shy away from, despite attempts by our political opponents to mischaracterise our motives. And I think in one of the worst speeches I've heard since I came to this Parliament only 4 years ago, I think Jamie Hepburn. It was interesting to hear Jamie Hepburn lecturing my colleague. It was interesting to hear Jamie Hepburn lecturing my colleague about bravery. He wouldn't be brave enough to even take an
Mr. Hepburn.
I think Mr. Hepburn is only reinforcing the impression of him as being a thug, but we'll leave that there. The main thrust of this debate, Deputy Presiding Officer, is that spending patterns here in Scotland. I will take an intervention.
I tried to intervene in the wildly blustering diatribe of Jamie Hepburn. At least on this occasion, it was only a verbal assault on us. And I also tried to intervene in the Cabinet Secretary, but they don't do debate, of course, over there. And I wanted to ask them if the Scottish Government has any concerns whatsoever about the £2 billion social security spending gap in Scotland. And I wonder if my Cabinet Secretary my colleague Craig Coy can perhaps enlighten us, because I'm none the wiser, because they don't do any debates.
Craig Coy.
I absolutely agree with Russell Finlay. It's simply staggering to say that the Cabinet Secretary is ignoring the fact that she has a £2 billion overspend, and that by the end of this decade she will have a £4.7 billion budget black hole. And we cannot expect working people, that's Scotland's taxpayers, to foot the bill. Because for clarity, let me say this to the Minister. Rising benefits by this level is not affordable, but it is also not desirable. But for too long, this has been the SNP's way. Stifle growth, ramp up the benefits bill and just hope that there are enough taxpayers out there to pick up the tab. But out there in the real world, with the people I speak to, people who have real jobs and real pressures, they are working harder. They're getting less in take-home pay after they pay the SNP and Labour's taxes, whilst those living on benefits all too readily seem to get it all too easily. And sadly now, Rachel Reeves is drinking from the same Kool-Aid as the Cabinet Secretary, with the benefits bill in England soaring at the very time as growth forecasts are being cut and taxes for businesses and workers are soaring. The point of no return, Minister, has not yet been reached. But both of our governments need to act now and to act urgently to prevent the public finances spiralling out of control. The people whose doors I knock on often tell me that they resent working so hard, feeling they are forgotten about, to pay for this government's misguided priorities. They don't resent paying taxes, Minister, but they do point across the street to the family on benefits who just returned from a foreign holiday when they themselves cannot afford a night out. They resent that not enough is being done to get people off benefits and back to work, creating a dependency culture that I suspect has been created for crude political purposes. Getting up, going to work, having a feel of... The Minister keeps chuntering away. If she wants to intervene, she's very welcome to.
Cabinet Secretary.
Grateful to the member. I have to say I'm genuinely flabbergasted at the continuous attempt of the Tories to come in other people. One week it's immigrants, next week it's poor people, then it's disabled people. I wonder what it's going to be next week. But one thing's guaranteed is the doors he's chapping on, they're not voting Tory next time round, are they?
Craig Hoy.
I think reflecting the very real concerns of the doorsteps that I've knocked on in Dumfries is not othering people, it's simply telling the Minister what's happening out there in the real world, people who don't have chauffeurs to ferry them from meeting to meeting. Now, ultimately, I don't have time. But before the government says, in relation to some benefits, that yes, some benefits do support people getting into work, we accept that. Liz Smith has accepted that. But much more data needs to be collected on the impact of benefits on people's working patterns, and also how many people on adult disability payment are actually also in work. The government doesn't have that data, and it is not going to look for that data. But the £5.4 billion being spent on the adult disability payment alone is not unsustainable. I'm very sympathetic to some of the points that Jeremy Balfour has made, but ultimately we must seek some methodology to try and reduce the number of people who are dependent upon that benefit. And if that means giving them the skills and more support to get into work full-time, that is something the government should be doing, rather than cutting the schools and colleges budget. But ultimately, as a country, we have to live within our means. And the introduction, for example, of the two-child benefit cap has saved taxpayers millions of pounds. Our benefit system should be there to provide a safety net, a hand up, not a hand out. But by Labour's own admission, removing the two-child benefit cap will cost £2 billion next year and rise to £3 billion by the end of the decade, again having to be paid by taxes from hard-working Britons. Ultimately, we have to be on... I won't, unless I can get the time back.
There's very limited time.
I'll take a very brief intervention.
I want to speak to the member just about the way in which we approach this. We cannot accuse people. The reality is that many people out there, and I knock doors every day, that many people out there understand that the people who require social security are in need. But the point that I want to make there is that if we want to make things fairer, then we need to look at the way in which the economic model runs
Thank you. Craig Hoy.
What I was rather hoping we should see was why Keir Starmer, having said in the election he was going to try and bring down the benefits bill, has run away at the first sign of gunfire from the Labour left. But ultimately, we have to be on the side of those people who put more into the system than they take out. If you worked hard during your life, saved, paid your taxes and done the right thing, you deserve dignity and a decent standard of living when you retire. I'm on the side of people who work hard, who want to get on in life through their own efforts and who want to leave something behind for their children and their grandchildren. But I also want to make sure that people in genuine hardship get the help they need. But we are in favour of a hand up, never just a hand out. And that's why we must have a welfare system in Scotland that encourages and incentivises work and self-reliance, not a life on benefits for some that are paid for by everybody else.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. That concludes the debate on controlling the rising benefits bill in Scotland, and there will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business. Point of order, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I intervened a couple of times around ADP. I should have declared that I am on higher rate ADP and happily in employment as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. That is now on the record. So